All right, I think we'll get going. It's 12 noon. Welcome everybody on this Wednesday, the 20th of June, 2018, one day before National Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's our great pleasure to have a speaker to acknowledge those happenings in our country, as well as all of the great work in the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My name is Barbara McDonald. I'm a registered nurse and nurse advisor at the SRNA, and it's my pleasure today to introduce Tim. I'll let the participants know that this session will be recorded and will be available so that we can have access to it in the days and months to come, and years potentially, in the event that they're unable to attend. So everyone who's online will have their lines muted, and Tim will present, but there's the opportunity to use the chat box if you have any questions, and we'll be able to help moderate that from our end. Tim is joining us today from Ottawa. I hope I got that right. He gave me a challenge to memorize his bio within the last 30 seconds. So Tim is a proud Indigenous veteran who served 10 years with the military before starting his undergraduate degree in political science. And he also has a master's degree in Canadian Studies from Carleton University in Ottawa, and as a negotiator and intergovernmental relations analyst for the government, and for the government of Northwest Territories. When he went to Ottawa to do his master's degree, he also became involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as an advisor to Senator Murray Sinclair. While with the TRC, he's delivered all kinds of presentations with respect to reconciliation. And we had the great pleasure of having Tim at our annual meeting in May, and it was an outstanding session. And we hope to repeat in person again in the near future, but wanted to also continue that relationship because there are so many profound messages around our calls to action and our journey for reconciliation. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring Tim to get the presentation going and sit back and enjoy, and then respond to the calls to action. So here you go, Tim.
Thank you. So I will just launch right in, and I just call it planting a seed for reconciliation. And what I am hoping is that if people can walk away maybe with a just bit better of an understanding. I actually had lunch with a director here in Ottawa, and I just said, you know what, understanding the other meets what I consider is reconciliation. And I said, I'm not an expert on LGBT issues or all gender issues. And I said, one of the things, if we create a safe space to allow new ideas to come in, then in my opinion, that's reconciliation. And so this is just hoping to understand the other just a bit better, and maybe a bit of the history. I'm certainly not here to point fingers, and what I am here hoping to do is just kind of shed a bit of light in an area that people may not necessarily be aware of. And this picture here just kind of is a mixture of the modern and the traditional. You can see the kids, they're probably at a powwow, they're practicing their spirituality, right? And in the background, of course, are cars. The gentleman in the top left-hand corner reminds me of my grandfather. So when I looked at this picture, it just really resonated with me. People don't realize powwows were banned in Canada. Indigenous peoples were not allowed to practice their own spirituality. But this very much is children, being children, but they're also practicing their spirituality and, performing their ceremonies. And all cultures around the world have ceremonies as they go through their life. And like I said, the gentleman in the top left-hand corner just reminds me of my grandfather. So, it's I do kind of give people a warning, that this is going to be an emotional conversation. It really is. It's meant to be because, it is a bit of our quiet chapter of shame, to be honest. People came up to us and they were a bit surprised at how much that they did not know, and that's a good starting point. One of the things, and I'm certainly aware of all the things that are going on, especially with the stupidity down in the States, and really what I think it's a beacon of shining light of what not to do. And especially those that are in their judgmental space, and especially with Donald Trump, and I just kind of sometimes I tweet on this, that those that understand will never judge. And for some reason, Donald Trump's face pops up when I say those that judge will never understand. And, that's a bit of our history. We should be also aware that we are not out of the, at a perfect time in our history, because there's still people that do publish and put Indigenous peoples offside, per se. And, when I read Tom Flanagan's book in 2001, it changed my life, because everything in his book continued to argue the justifications for residential schools. And throughout his book, he did advocate that we just need to continue along the stream of assimilation, that Indians just need to be assimilated. And that was what he wanted to do. And so it was really offensive. And there's still people that make those kind of arguments. But they also generally will start with demonizing the other. And if you listen to Donald Trump, by all means, is he everything about demonizing people that are trying to come into the country, right? And so it's just, the history that's being made today isn't always necessarily the best history that is going on. And we just need to not look very far to see kind of some of the sad realities of the demonizing the other. But when I started around this, I did this slide used to be later in the presentation, but I thought I'd bring it up because it really is a story of heroes. One of the things that we don't realize, that this started really in the 1980s, when survivors as children were taken away from their parents, and realized what had happened to them in residential schools. And what happened to them was wrong. And they initially started bringing individual cases before the courts. And it grew. Enough survivors were starting to bring their cases through the courts, and eventually it became a class action suit. It met the criteria of a class action suit. And eventually, when that grew, the parties, including 6 churches and the government of Canada, I think saw the light of day and realized that we need to propose a out-of-court settlement. And that kind of really started the journey, which created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But this is a story of heroes. It started with individual survivors, and I kind of want to honor them. They continue to do the heavy labor of sharing their truth, right? And by doing so, a lot of will share their truth in schools and churches and throughout their communities. And this country really is better as a result of them. And I kind of want to honor them, but in particular the resilience that they still bear in sharing their truth. People were shocked at the beginning of the TRC. They were like, how is it that I didn't know about this? And they were a bit embarrassed that they went to university and they started their career in Canada. They didn't know, and they were just shocked. When I started lecturing while I was at the TRC, especially in places like universities, I asked people to raise their hand how many people knew very little about the legacy of residential schools. And quite a few people raised their hands. What I noticed in the last little while, when I asked the same first-year university students how many people know very little, I noticed a lot less. But there are still people raising their hands. And, I've noticed the difference in the last number of years, but we still have some work to do. But people were generally shocked that they didn't know as much as they could have or should have. And the reality is that is Canada's quiet chapter of shame. And this story is not in our history books. And I think one of my greatest moments at the TRC was able to get the commissioners to sit in front of all 13 ministers of education. They get together on an annual basis. They're going to get together again in July. And we kind of gave them a challenge, and we informed them that we had to look at their curriculum. And we told them that your history books that you're teaching to your children, to your students, is not reflective of our reality, and gave them a challenge. And I didn't realize in high school curriculum, there's a mandatory and a non-mandatory. And teachers generally go to their comfort level, which is the non-mandatory component in teaching things that are of specific interest. So we knew that if we were going to make sure that when every school child leaves the public system, that they should have an accurate snapshot of our reality. And we made a connection that this is, if we're going to have ethical children, in realizing that our country is good, but it's good, bad, and ugly history as well. And you know, we need to understand that that our history, we shouldn't just bask ourselves in the Canadian flag and pretend that everything is perfect, because it's not. And that's one of the challenges, I think, that we realized that at that time, that we didn't really have an accurate snapshot of our history. And I think that's the case on many different fronts, like I said, on LGBT issues, you know, and gender issues as well. We do need to go into our history books, and we need to rewrite it and have children, as they exit the school system, understand before they go to university, have some of those critical lens on. And that was our biggest challenge to the 13 ministers of education. The two leaders at that time, around 2014, that stepped forward was both Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And it was easy for them to make it because it was a smaller jurisdiction, to make, as part of the mandatory curriculum, to make some changes that was reflective. But I also want to acknowledge Saskatchewan as well. Now, obviously in Saskatchewan, the lens that they wanted to wear was the realities around the number of treaties and such. They kind of made it, you know, a commitment for a mandatory, but through a treaty lens as well. And that's, you know, that's the beauty of this country, right? And each of the 13 jurisdictions, you know, it's very much different on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but certainly take on the challenge and make appropriate to your particular jurisdiction around that, especially for the at the high school age, and in particular at the grade 10. That's when the socialites really start coming on, and it was at that time that we needed to capture them. So you know, it is a bit of our history, right? And I'm going to start using inappropriate because they're historically accurate. But you know, one of the, we can't talk about residential schools without talking about Duncan Campbell Scott. And it's interesting, as I sit here in Ottawa, I know where the House of Commons is, whatever office I'm sitting in, because I always point to it. And Duncan Campbell Scott in the House of Commons said that he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem, and he viewed Indians as a problem, and the objective is continued until there was not a single Indian Canada that's not been absorbed. And sorry, I don't have the date on that, but this is 1921 that he said in the House of Commons, this statement. And so in his opinion, that it was an Indian problem, he just needed to get rid of the problem. Now, one of the things that I also wanted to do was to capture, because in our history books, it was not necessarily people, and I tell public servants, especially here in Ottawa, you know, the road to hell for Indigenous peoples have been paved with good intentions. And as we demonize someone like Duncan Campbell Scott, he really did believe that what he was doing was right, as misguided as it was, you know, but fortunately, there were voices that saw things a little bit different. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Peter Bryce. Now, people don't realize who he is, but he was the one that really stood up against Duncan Campbell. He worked for him. He was in the provincial, and in the late 1890s, this thing called public health was coming around. And, you know, he was one of the innovators in public health, and he wrote the first Public Health Act for Ontario. And other jurisdictions, including the United States, looked to what people like Dr. Peter Bryce had done. When he was hired to be the equivalent of a public health guy for what is now known as Department of Indian Affairs, he went out to Western Canada, and he went and visited 35 residential schools. And in his report to Duncan Campbell Scott, in his report called A National Crime, he believed the conditions were being deliberately created in our residential schools to spread infectious diseases. What is not part of this knowledge is the investment to change the residential schools, to bring it down below 50%, because this is now in the public record. In many of the schools, half the children were dying. And he thought it was made of some very simple recommendations. The cost associated with those recommendations to implement was going to be in the range of $10,000 to $15,000, and that was it. And he took on, like I said, with his recommendations, and Peter Bryce repeatedly called upon Duncan Campbell Scott to make things better, to improve the conditions. Now, Duncan Campbell Scott made it clear, and he did not listen to the advice. but he understood the extent of the death rates. Now, one of the things, because the 50%, that was those children that died in residential schools. The reality was, if you were diagnosed with tuberculosis, or consumption is what they called it in the day, you were sent home. So if you died at home, you were not going to be counted. And those were the 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education that they received therein. And those are the children that died at the school. And so when you think about the children that died at home, that blows out of the water the 50% number. And, you know, Duncan Campbell Scott knew, but he also said in the House of Commons, this does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution. And I know the word final solution has been used in our world history, and it really was, when you see it a problem, we have a final solution of our Indian problem. And I know those words can feel a bit uncomfortable. They should, because that is part of our history. That is our uncomfortable truth. And Dr. Peter Bryce was fired, removed from his position, or he quit, sorry. And eventually, Dr. Peter Bryce took his report, he took out the recommendation and released his report anyways. And when Dr. Peter Bryce retired in the 1920s, he said, that's it. And he was freed of the confidentiality agreement that he had. He re-released his report and put back in there the final recommendations. And we're talking basic changes to the residential schools that would bring down the mortality rate. But he was shocked that this was not going to be a national outcry, and he was shocked. And sadly, it wasn't too long afterwards that he had passed away. It was very interesting, actually. Duncan Campbell Scott had a daughter, and he sent her away to London, to a private school. And it turns out his only daughter had died, and it turns out that she had died of tuberculosis. So even in his own pain, and he was aware, I just thought, boy, that must have been something that, a part of your family legacy. Dr. Peter Bryce, actually, he does have children. He did have children, he did have grandchildren, and they are still around, and they're certainly very much aware of their great-grandfather's legacy. And there is a new film that is out documenting. It was made by Dr. Peter Bryce's great-grandson. So if you get a chance to see it, it's a very good film. All that to say, Duncan Campbell Scott, his only daughter had passed from tuberculosis. So his family legacy, and he's buried over here in Ottawa at the cemetery here. But and it turns out that Duncan Campbell Scott and Dr. Peter Bryce are actually buried in the same Beechwood Cemetery here. But I digress. Just kind of talk about the realities, how they were going to see it. It was to go to civilize these Indians, educate them, and Christianize them. Of course, their only Jesus, God, is the only God, and all they need is a good education. And let's be very clear, residential schools was not about education. It's about removing children from their parents. Christianization, and then once they want to be like us, and this is under the, the philosophy of, of the day, which is, these savage children, godless children, they should be just like us, right? The white man, per se. And if you happen to be from Africa or a black, or you happen to be a savage, that was the moral justification for slavery and residential schools. And it was what they call a development spectrum. And if you happen to have dark skin, you were at the lower end of the development spectrum. And because we are white people, that is our justification. And why would they not want to be just like us? And that was, a bit of, class that I took on all that. So that was the development spectrum, right? And this was to be done through 142. It is an evolving number. I actually think in the end it was 143. But you will see in some of the reports it was initially 139 federally funded church-run residential schools. And this is a map. And if you'll notice in Newfoundland, Labrador, there are none per se. The federal government of the day, the conservative government back in the day, they said, well, the residential schools that were in existence at the time were since before 1941, of course, the year Newfoundland, Labrador joined Confederation. So it did not accept any of the residential schools. Canada used to make in the 80s the same argument about veterans, for World War II veterans, that when World War I and World War II veterans, well, that was before you joined Confederation. And then eventually the stupidity around that argument, and they were using the same argument for residential schools. So this Minister Carolyn Bennett, there were some court cases that were starting to make their way through the court systems. And this minister here in Ottawa, Carolyn Bennett, proposed an out-of-court settlement agreement because she kind of saw, I think, the stupidity around the argument, which is, well, they were before Confederation, so they don't count. And she proposed an out-of-court settlement agreement. So, you know, this is, people also don't realize, residential school was one of many policies. The numbered treaties was one of them. Let me be very clear. The negotiation and intentional non-implementation of the treaties was a very specific policy, because the thoughts of the day is the Indians are weaker and they're just dying off. And if you look at the mortality rate in residential school, that just gave them their own justification. See how weak they are, and they're dying off. So, you know, we'll negotiate, we'll get certainty around getting Indians off the land and into reserves and free up the land for development. But you know what, they're not going to be around, so we don't really have to worry as operating not in good faith as it was. We're you know, and not one of the treaties that have been negotiated have been fully implemented. I come from Treaty 8, Treaty 11 territory in the Northwest Territories, and we're still under negotiation. And I'm certainly aware of the situation in Saskatchewan with TLE, Treaty Land Entitlement. Let's be very clear, there were a number of other policies. And if you also look at the situation with slaughtering of Inuit dog teams in the north, they were on the land. So how can we get them off the land? Well, let's just slaughter their dog teams. I've heard many stories of the impacts of that policy as well. And, you know, other policies, 60 Scoop, and I think it's very easy for people to make the linkage between what's going on today and removing of children, you know, into foster care is just yet another one of the policies. You know, people like Cindy Blackstock is really a thorn in the side here in Ottawa, and I hope she gets a Nobel Peace Prize because she is doing the right thing. You know, one of the things that I always struggled with when I was at the TRC is we had to remind the federal government. You see, the TRC was created, and all the parties that was part of the final agreement, we were all responsible to the courts because it was an out-of-court settlement agreement. And this was, the TRC was the only one created in Canadian history that was responsible to the courts and not responsible back to the federal government. The Missing and Murdered Inquiry is responsible back to the federal government. And the federal government of the time, the day, the Conservative government needed to be reminded that we were not responsible back to the federal government. We, along with the federal government, were responsible back to the courts. And we had to seek clarification before the courts 5 times. And when I say that, I mean we had to sue the federal government 5 times to remind the federal government. And the courts sided with the TRC. The brilliant thing about Justice Sinclair, the chair of the TRC, was he's been a judge for 30 years. So he could do a pretty good own legal analysis of whether or not you know, we were going to be successful. And I say that in a facetious way, but you know, the courts sided with the federal government, or with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all 5 times. And in some ways we're looking a bit sheepishly or looking sternly at the federal government. Really? This is your argument? And in particular, the biggest one, in my opinion, was to make sure that the federal government released all of its documents, and as it said it was going to do. So all that to say, people don't realize that these are on this map, it's 139 residential schools. But when you also include day schools and boarding schools and other institutions with the same intent, provincial run residential schools or territorial run residential schools, that number, when you include all of those numbers, it brings the number up into the 1,400. So that just throws, and I know in our history books, and we talk about 139 or 142 residential schools and 150,000 children taken over the day. That just throws that 150,000 number completely out the window. And if you just do the math, when you're thinking it being 1,400 schools right across Canada, and you can imagine all of the dots on this map. But this map I took from the TRC webpage to put in this presentation, just to kind of show the, especially the concentration in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Right around this time, and the documents will show that there was very much a concentration on removing children from the parents. And of course, in our history books, especially with the Louis Riel Rebellion in 1885, is that there was a specific concentration. In particular, if we are to remove the children from the parents and have them in our residential schools, the chances were less that they were going to raise arms against the government. And that's why you see so many residential schools. There was in consolidation with the numbered treaties as well. And even though the numbered treaties, all the treaties do give the provision for a school, none of the treaties actually say a residential school. So even though you got a treaty, you have provisions in there for a school. The reality was there were no schools. It was all residential schools of the day. And that's a bit of our history book. People may not be aware of the last residential school actually was, and you can see Saskatchewan really, and I kind of said this in my presentation, there really was ground zero for residential schools. So that is a bit of our legacy, and the impacts of residential school will have an impact on the good people that are working in the healthcare system in Saskatchewan. You know, one of the things that we're just going to unpack a few pictures here. And one of the things that I realized, I now have a severe PTSD diagnosis. And for me, it is three things. One, childhood trauma. Two, my 10 years of service in the military. But three, it was all triggered in listening to the survivors and realizing a bit of my trauma that I was able to keep at bay, keep those secrets away, were starting to come up and haunt me in the middle of the night when I was sitting there listening to the survivors share their truth and realizing how much of their story was really my story. And while I was at the TRC, it was very interesting because we had a lot of cultural supports wherever we went, and we generally followed the cultural protocols of the area that we're in. Wherever we were, the elders always saw me, and they were always pulling me aside and offering me some prayers and support, and it was great. But you know, I had to learn how to pray, and one of the things that I realized was, for me, if people have, I think it's important to have a God. I think it's important, even if people go to church, I think that's great. And one of the things that I do share is that if you're a Catholic, Anglican, Muslim, Buddhist, it doesn't matter to me. Just go and have a conversation with your Creator, whoever he or she is. And I generally, I'm not here to judge, especially Christianity. Our history books show what it is, and I wanted to talk about that before I pop this up. And for me, what was important about this picture wasn't necessarily the words up above, but it was the fact that they're all using the right hand. And what was shocking to me were the stories wherever we went. If someone happened to be left-handed, and I think the number is that there's about 15% of our population is left-handed. And if a survivor was sharing their truth around the fact they were in a very dark space if they were left-handed, and the extent that the administrators or the nurses or the priests or what have you, the nuns were trying to stop people from being left-handed was immense, and people were in a particularly dark space if they were left-handed. And it was, I've given this presentation, I'd say 200 times, but it was only the last presentation that I gave. You can see the tall gentleman third from the right. It looks like his left hand is bound behind his back. And I never saw that until the last presentation, where someone just said, oh my God. And it's amazing. Sometimes you go through these pictures, you miss these things. And we heard these stories about people's, you know, being strapped for using their left hand and such. So, you know, and it was of course, in the, you know, the Christian creation story with Adam and Eve. Apparently Adam reached up with his left hand to grab the apple. And there are apparently references in the Bible about the demonization of being left-handed and such. And people took that literally just to make sure they pounded out of the survivors, the students of the day, to try and make everyone into the right, to use the right hand. But that was what was powerful about this picture, was not necessarily the words, but the fact that everyone was using the right hand. You know, this picture here is was profound, and the more I looked at it was the fact that, you know, I was actually born in 1965, so it resonated with me because it was more in my lifetime. And you know, very much a color photo brings it into the modern as well. I'm ex-military, and I recognize these beds and I recognize these blankets. And so there's now a military connection as well. These are military issue beds and these are military issue blankets. And very much militaristic in the sense that all their hair is cut the same. Everyone's aware of the situation with, especially for Indigenous peoples, this sacredness about their long hair and the journey, the ceremony that Indigenous peoples have with their hair. And that was just all cut off. So you could see this, especially the uniformity around with the everyone going to the bed, into the military bed with the military sheets, wearing kind of military pajamas per se, and everyone's haircut is the same, right? And this to me, it reminds me of my wife. I don't want to diss my wife or anything, but she wants to take perfect pictures. And I have 2 children, and she's always saying to my daughter, honey, smile, smile. And the girl in the back, the farthest in the back, that all looks to me like a very inauthentic smile. And that's what I get in our photos when my wife is saying, smile, honey, will you smile? And for me, I'm all about just taking the moment. And drives me crazy when she's like, smile. And it looks to me, just resonated with that. You can look to 2 to the left, to the girl with something in her arm. And honestly, she looks scared to me. Even though this is the United Church of Canada calendar, where they're trying to show the greatness of residential schools. And this is a month of May, for goodness sakes. And the girl looks scared. It looks like she doesn't know what's going on. And, you know, obviously, where's the parents, right? And you're hearing a lot of those stories on CNN is when children are being taken from their parents, right? And that's just wrong. And these children, you know, how many of us, we're in a fortunate situation to have our moms tuck us in at night. And so this girl, it just looks scared to me. And the girl on the far left, it was profound, because one time my daughter said to my mom, said to her mom, my wife, and when she wasn't giving that perfect smile, she just did exactly that. She took her fingers and jammed it in her mouth and gave the smile. And she said, okay, can you take the picture now? And that looks to me like what that girl is doing. And you know, what these stories of, you know, heroes that I was referring to, this girl in the front, it looks to me like she's being defiant. And we heard so many heroic stories of students not and they were running away, many at their own peril, and we're all far too familiar of children dying, running, trying to run to their homes, many in the middle of the winter. When we had our Saskatchewan event, I went up, we were driving, we were 3 days from the beginning of our national event, and I had a survivor. There were some people walking from northern Saskatchewan, and Prince Albert, I think it was, and they were about 100 kilometers out, and so we drove to meet with them. And it turns out we drove by the residential school, so we pulled over to which is now an empty field, and the only thing that existed was the cemetery that was completely overgrown. There was appeared to be an empty field. Of course, we knew the legacy that the wooden crosses that were given to the children that had died, of course, they were all just deteriorated and have been returned to the land. The only headstones were for the priests and the nuns, and those were given, you know, normal headstones, granite headstones, and so we could read those. And there was only one in which it was a 3-year-old girl, and the family could afford a granite headstone for this girl. Her last name was a Henneque. And it was interesting because the survivor, as he was kind of starting to recollect, he was like, oh, hey, we used to have to run across this field and to that far wood line. And that far wood line was 3 to 5 miles away. And they had to do that every morning, including in the winter. And it was shocking to me. He was 9 years old, and he had to run to that wood line every morning and turn around and run back. And it was just shocking that it kind of made it real, some of the reality. And we heard so many stories of defiance, in particular with students, older siblings protecting their younger siblings, you know, students sneaking food to their friend that is locked in the basement and is going to go without food, maybe just water or bread. And, you know, just many small stories of heroic stories along the way. And that's what this girl reminds me of. She's like, I'm not smiling, I'm not participating, you just take the picture and let's just get on with this, right? And then, of course, what is very profound as we unpack these pictures is the fact that if you notice the color of the doll. And as we unpack these pictures, it's just more and more, you know, parts get told, right? For me, this is was profound to me, and this is a bit of my personal story. So this is Aklavik, Northwest Territory. Aklavik borders the Inuvialuit and the Gwich'in traditional territories, right on the border. But, you know, it's the words that Inuit children live too far, had to stay at school during the summer. And that was my family's story, was my mother was taken when she was 4, and she was not allowed to go home until she finished at age 11. And she was returned, did not remember them. And so from 4 to 11, and this is the time when I generally introduce my mom's story. She got pregnant with my sister when she was 12, and she got pregnant with me when she was 15, and she had 2 more children when she returned. So it's easy for me to know how old my mom is, and I'm not close with her. She did not raise me, and she did not raise my sister. Of course, she was 12 or 13 when she had her. And in many of the communities, it's quite often the aunties or the grandparents that raised the children. I've talked to my mother about 50 times in my life. I'm not close with her because she didn't raise me, as I mentioned. But, you know, she has a very interesting journey in her life journey as well. And had four children by the time she left her teens. And, you know, still dealing with a legacy of residential school. This is a famous photo. I'm not surprised if a strong majority, if not everyone, has seen this. But this is Thomas More, and it's the same picture a year later, right? And it reminded me of some of the pictures, the before and after. You know, the civilized child on the right, and the savage boy on the left with the long hair. You know, you can see the you know, the fur in the background, and you know, this is very much a costume. It is not traditional regalia. Let's be very clear about this. I've asked a number of different people across this country, and no one recognizes this. And you know, there was especially more so in the States, there were photographers that would travel around with costume and put the little savage child in the picture, and you can see in the history books, it's the same costume as this person. And that was really a misunderstanding. Of course, people don't realize there's 57 nations across this country, and they don't follow, as you may be aware, they don't follow the same language, they don't follow the same practices, the same customs, the same ceremonies, very much different in on a case-by-case basis. And you know, it's just kind of sad. And of course, the picture on the right, a good civilized boy in a uniform, maybe his hair is cut short. You know, the Mother Nature is cultivated now, put in a potted plant, so you can see that, and very much linear. It's very straight lines, is very Western philosophy. I actually had a friend that was Inuit that the first time he left the North, he was a teenager, and he was in Winnipeg. He had to go for medical reason, and he went walking around. He wanted to go see the city, and he asked someone. He goes, he got lost in the city, and he took the courage to ask them. It took him 3 hours just to say, "Can you tell me? I'm trying to find this place, this hospital." And the person, said, "No problem. Just go up 3 blocks and turn left. It'll be on your left-hand side." And he stood there, and he didn't know what a block was, first of all. But he understood the block is a square. And when he was looking down the street, he was looking at the windows, which were square. The buildings were square. Everything was square in his view. And he was too embarrassed to ask someone, "Can you tell me what a block was?" And it took him another 3 hours to eventually find the hospital that he was supposed to go to. But, you know, there was just a bit of the difference in some of our realities, right? For Indigenous peoples, you know, some of them still don't know what a block is. And that's very much, the straight lines is very much of a Western. And of course, a desired outcome, right? And I don't know what that is behind his left elbow. I think it's a riding hat, which is very British, as you can imagine, and the uniformity around this. And this is generally the time that I reference the fact, if you remember, Duncan Campbell Scott sees enemy Indians as a problem. And it's very easy. You want to make them a problem, you make a military problem. And when you want to make them a military problem, you put a gun in his hand. And if you notice in the picture on the left-hand side, you'll see the gun. And, you know, Indians didn't carry guns, right? There was no cowboys and Indians in which there were handguns. Indigenous peoples, and it's is easy part of our history, right? I'm ex-military, and I'm very much aware of the heroic acts that many Indigenous people, especially in World War I, not to say not in World War II, but because in the regiment that I served in with PPCLI, the name Tommy Prince is very much a big part of our history. But snipers in World War I, most were Indigenous, and it was because they were raised on the land and they went out hunting, and the very similar procedures in hunting were very similar to sniping. And so Indians of the day, in particular still today, don't carry handguns. Indigenous peoples carry rifles. And so you can see even how much this is out of context as well. And it was a high school student, actually, while I was giving this presentation, showing this picture, just said, holy crap, the kid on the right is actually whiter. And if you notice, the desired outcome is to be white. And we heard so many stories at the TRC of how some of the administrators, nuns and such, would try and bleach the child who happened to have darker skin, try and bleach it to lighten their skin. Of course, when you use bleach, it doesn't have the same impact. It just burns someone's skin. And we heard a lot of horrific stories around this. And it's true. The boy on the right is whiter. And, you know, we just thought, you know what, they must have played with the development, but just to show this is a desired outcome, right? That must have played with the development of the camera. I do want to acknowledge, as I did with Dr. Peter Bryce, you know, some of the things that have gone on in modern times as well. And this is you know, a stained glass window. I want to inform people that I have a severe diagnosis of PTSD. So sometimes I forget things, and so I beg for your forgiveness if I'm forgetting words. I almost did in this, and if I do forget a word, just bear with me if you don't mind. It's my PTSD tripping me up, and that's one of the indicators of PTSD is your memory is impacted as well. So this is Christy Belcourt, and this is the stained glass window in the House of Commons. And if I want to give you homework, if you want to accept homework, I would love for you to read. Just Google her name and stained glass window, and she talks, and it's so eloquent, her words. And she acknowledges the 2008 apology that the Prime Minister made in the House of Commons. So that's where you see the reference in 2008. I can't believe it has been 10 years. As a veteran that was in Ottawa at the time, I was honored to bring in the Canadian flag. And it was a historical day, not necessarily because, you know, he was a conservative, and the TRC struggled with the Conservative Party. And so I knew that the Prime Minister was going to apologize. So what was important for me that day, not necessarily was the Prime Minister's apology. It was more the fact that the survivors needed to hear the Leader of the Government of Canada apologize on behalf of the Government of Canada. And I do want to acknowledge that it was historical. I knew in all the communities, I asked, what did you guys do the day of the apology? And every last community that I had been to, they all shut down for the day and allowed the survivors the sacred space to witness the Government of Canada apologize. So the journey, any words that I can use, it is a journey starting in the bottom right-hand corner, and it goes up, and she acknowledges it is our country's history and the decolonization that this country has to go through. And I would like to encourage you to go online to read her words. They're so eloquent. The residential school in the bottom left-hand corner, and moving up that one pane, that is the Mush Hole, which is in Bradford, Ontario. It was one of the darkest residential schools. And sadly, in my journey, and I didn't realize this, as we were listening to survivors, there were certain communities that you could tell the level of anger in that community. And it was because of the depth of woundedness that residential school had in that community and in that region as well. And I was sorry that I had been around long enough to be able to see that reality. And the Mush Hole, or the Mohawk Institute, was one of the darkest in Canada. So I am going to try and pull up a video here, and I hope that it works. So what I do want to say, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I want to cue this up. So this was a TRC, this was up in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, and our TRC events, we would have cultural celebrations at night. So this was a movie night. And there were times in our journeys that people just shared incredible moments, and this is one of them. It changed our protocols, and I'll explain after you see this. So this is just a moment that I witnessed that I went and captured to share with everyone here.
Anything happened to me, I want to apologize to my family for what I put them through. I could tell my grandchildren, I could tell my great-grandchildren that I love them. But with my own children, I can't. I'll tell you, one time I was at a meeting with the Youth Justice Committee, and the facilitator went all around the room telling us, could you tell me what love means to you? Then when it came to my turn, I told him, I can't answer. I can't. She said, why? How can, my answer was, how can I give love to somebody that I never received when I was a child? I'd like to know how I can say to my children with meaning and all the years I missed that I love them. I didn't, it wasn't me that put them through what they did, what I did. It hurts. It hurts me to think about what I missed.
You know what? You just do exactly what you just did right now.
Okay, so I'm freezing it here just to unpack this picture. So the reality was, and let's be clear, let's just say he's 70 years old. He could be 65, but his children, let's just say they're 45 or 50. He was asking, and in this room is about 450 people, and he was in front of a room full of strangers, was saying, how can I tell my children that I love them? So there's two things. One, he is at a healing point in his journey to realize, and I suspect he's estranged from his children. That's just my gut tells me. But he's asking, you know, he's at a point in his life, you know, maybe the last chapter of his life, that he's begging, you know, a stranger, basically, someone that showed a movie. How can I tell my children I love them? And the intergenerational component around this is his children, let's just say they're 45 years of age, have never heard their father say, I love you. I talk to my child, my son, he now has a phone, he's 13 years old, and at the end of every sentence, he says, I love you, Dad. And he beats me to it because I want to tell my children 3 and 4 times a day, I love you. And as difficult it is that may be in our life journey to say that, his children has never heard their father say, I love you. And this changed the TRC protocols. What we did at the end of every person that talked, we were burning them CDs. And this was one of the things that we had done. It was because of him sharing his truth. And so they make sure that he had a copy of the CD before he left. So that if he wasn't able to, if his children, like I said, I suspect they were estranged, if they weren't talking to him, then they could at least see that it's on the record of him saying, I love my children. And if he's not in a space, then at least it's on a record for his children to be able to view. Commissioner Marie Wilson, one of the commissioners, there were three commissioners, Willie Littlechild, Marie Wilson, and of course Senator Sinclair. Marie Wilson actually told me this, and she said, I hear every day that when we're hearing testimony or people sharing their truth, is that someone comes up and they, at least once a day, someone says, I never meant to tell my story. But they feel safe in their space that's been created for them, that they are willing, and sometimes they've never told the story and they're sharing it for the first time, sometimes with their partners, sometimes from partners for 30, 40, 50, 60 years are hearing them share their truth. And the other one is that they never meant to tell their story. So this is Paul, that is the next gentleman that's about to speak. He was working for the government in Northwest Territories. He was a bylaw inspector, just to make sure that we were following all the bylaws. But he got in the room and he chose to share his truth. And this is one of the most powerful moments that I had witnessed in my 4 years with the TRC. And this is Paul.
I thought I would be brave to face the demons that haunted me for 49 years. But I see today and since Monday that it still affects me with the things that happened through the 49 years that I kept hidden in me. I left home, and I didn't know why or where I was going, but I went into a plane with my sister and brother back in 1960, 62, 61, 62. And then we came to this building that used to sit across here. And then they separated us. I don't know why they separated us, but like stories I've heard, their clothes were taken. Mine was taken as well. My parents bought me some clothing before I came to Grolier Hall, and it was taken from me, and I had to wear what they had given to me. My winter clothes also was taken. Never did see them again. After our separation from my sister and brother, I wasn't able to speak to them again. My mom come to visit me at one time, and I couldn't even see her. And I was taken from my bed with my mouth covered and I don't remember going into the room, his room. I developed a scab between my crotch from my below my belly button right down through my inner thighs. I don't know how long I was like that, but I had to walk with my legs spread. And I was too scared to go see the sister, the nun, or the nurse, because I didn't know what to say. Somehow it got healed, but I carried that sexual abuse and assault for 49 years. And that's what impacted that residential, not the residential school, but the person impacted my life until I was 49. My first wife passed away in 2007. She never even knew about this. But I contemplated suicide in 1989. But it's by the grace of God that I sit here today. It's by the grace of God that He stopped me from going to the rifles in the porch when I was going to it. And I stopped. I thought, what are my children and my wife is going to say? How are they going to live seeing their dad dead in the porch? I no longer live by the number 142. I'm Paul Budrak, and I have the right to live. And I have the right to be happy because I know I deserve it. And my children, if they can hear me, they have the right to come say, Dad, we didn't like what you did. And I can say I know and I'm sorry. And I thank this gathering here for listening to my story. It hasn't been an easy road, but we're not alone in it. Thank you.
I think it's really important that survivors have the courage to tell.
Okay. I will continue. So, you know, when they proposed an out-of-court settlement agreement, the government of Canada and the churches, survivors said yes, but we need to create a truth and reconciliation because Canadians needed to hear and survivors needed to share, and we needed to get all the documents. So they gave the TRC a mandate, and that was our sacred guidance that the TRC was very committed to doing. And part of that, we had 7 national events, regional events as well. We started working with school boards. There was education days, and we went online. People were shocked in hearing Canada's quiet chapter online, and they were a bit offended by that because Canada was very quick to go to the United Nations and tout its own human rights and point fingers at other countries and not realizing that that they were doing what they were doing. And so there was a bit of shock around this. The thing about the TRC in the world, this was the only one like it in the world because generally TRCs are created, as in South Africa, and the Nuremberg trials was the first real TRC as a result of regime change. This was the only one like it in the world that was as a result that had concentrated on children, treatment of children. And like I said before, this was the only one like it in Canadian history that was responsible to the courts. So it had a very unique flavor, and this is kind of the mandate. But you can see in red here, it says recommendations. And so we were talking about in our development because we were really struggling with the TRC, and we were really struggling with the relationship. And Justice St. Clair, you know, the word recommendation just was not enough. And so he basically said we needed to call it calls to action. And, you know, we had to have some conversations about this, you know, that the mandate said recommendation, not calls to action. He said, I don't care. That's not good enough. You know, I can recommend to everyone online that you eat healthy, but that's just simply a recommendation. If you want to go have a burger, go have a burger. And he said, if we're going to change the trajectory of this country, we're going to change in the future how Indigenous peoples are going to be written in our history books, how we're going to change the way we operate to include Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous histories, Indigenous philosophies, to allow us space for Indigenous issues to be, it needed to be more than a simple recommendation, and that's where you can see the calls to action. And, you know, there's some great recommendations. There are some specific, so I actually opened up the wrong. There are some specific ones for your field. And so what I would like you to do, and I know Terry and other good people and SRNA has done some good work, is to make sure you continue to do the good work. One of the things that I do recommend now, or realize that there's an approach around the mental health, and in the federal government in particular, but there has been some good work on the mental health. It's just really, for me in my mental health journey, and especially with I've kind of incorporated a couple slides that, you know, that around, you know, there's 3 departments in the federal government that is doing good things, and that it's basically providing accommodations for people that are suffering from mental health challenges. And one of the things that I'm doing is I'm kicking ass around here is to make sure that in our accommodations, generally what people do is like, yeah, you can be wounded, but you need to go away and do it. You know, you can you know, you get yourself a note and we'll provide an accommodation. But once you're out of sick leave, then you have to take time off to heal. And that was not an appropriate way to follow. So the military, what they do is they're like, because they lost a lot of people through PTSD, and then they realize that there's a gap. And so they just said, forget this. We're going to keep people as wounded as they may be, because in my particular case, I have difficulty with writing, but I give this presentation. So I'm not at work providing briefing notes and stuff. I'm off giving this presentation. I have permission from the federal government. If it's a paid gig, then I take annual, but I donate a lot of time to give this presentation, and that's my accommodation. And it's been a pretty amazing journey. But you know, D&D follows that, is the fact that they do keep people as wounded as they may be, and you know, that's one of the things that they provide those supports at the front, and not have to go away. When you're healed, then you can come back. And so this is my little challenge for people at the front end, to provide supports that may be you know, in people as they start struggling in their mental health journey. And the realities are, if you provide that safe space to be wounded, there's an inherent resiliency. If we judge the other, oh, you're just trying to fake, you're just trying to get, you know, you can't will this stuff away. But I tell you, if you have a supportive workplace, and if people, especially on the front line, start suffering from in mental health as a result of their work, you need to provide those supports to those individuals right up front. And I'll tell you right now, for any executive, someone comes in and, you know, we need humanness, humanity where we work. And sometimes people struggle. And you know what? If you're an executive and you provide that space for someone to communicate some of their woundedness, boy, they're going to recover faster, in my opinion. And if they don't, at least we're not continuing to wound that person by judging them. And that's one of the things that I try and to share with people is to provide that safe space, especially for frontline workers that are going to be impacted. I'm thinking about, in particular, the missing and murder inquiry, because people are giving it all. A lot of TRC employees are now suffering, ex-TRC employees. And I'm sorry to say, when I look at those videos, I get emotional, because we had a lot of contractors, and I was very saddened to hear that one of our contractors, actually, he was a cameraman, and he was a contractor. So, you know, he went on to the next job, but he filmed, and he was behind looking at the survivors, and there were no supports available for him. And I was just saddened to hear that he ended his pain. And when I say ended his pain, I mean he took his life. And one of the things that I realized is that people that commit suicide, they're not ending their life, they're ending their pain. And, you know, I come from two wounded communities, right? The Indigenous communities, but the veterans communities. And I am fully supported in an amazing way by the Veterans Affairs. You know, if I tried to slide under the supports that are available for Indigenous peoples, very little. And so I'm getting all the supports I can. And I've since realized that, you know, veterans were committing suicide. They were just ending their pain. And I realized that that's what a lot of Indigenous peoples in their suffering and their PTSD as a result of residential schools, you know, they're drinking, they're numbing their PTSD, they're drugging or doing other crazy things. They're ending their they're trying to settle down their PTSD. And for those, you saw one of them, he was talking about his suicide. He wasn't going to commit suicide. He was going to end his pain. And we just need to make sure that for those that are wounded, we need to have the supports that are available, because if those supports aren't there, people are just going to end their pain. So all that to say, I just want to, you know, this is a story of heroes, right? And you saw two heroes just lay it out there. And I wish I had the opportunity. I'm actually heading north to the Northwest Territories on Monday. I'm going home. I need to be with my family. I need to go on the land because I need to heal. And I need to just kind of be there. And you heard two survivors just share their truth, right? So I kind of want to acknowledge them. you know, one of the things that that I do tell people, right, there's residential schools in the legacy and other policies, but in this particular case, badly damaged relationship between Indigenous peoples. There was a student-on-student abuse as well. It damaged their relationships with their families, their communities, and churches, and potential relationship with churches and government and non-Indigenous peoples. And people don't realize this country as a whole is wounded. And, you know, people sometimes want to say, well, this is an Indigenous issue. It's not. And the challenge that I think Justice Sinclair, Senator Sinclair, and others, including me, wants to put out that this is a Canadian issue, and we're asking for everyone to get on board with the, you know, this journey of reconciliation, because it's going to require everyone. You know, I acknowledge Phil Fontaine, as wounded as he is in his journey. He was the first national leader that came forward and said I was sexually abused in residential schools. In the courageous step that he took in acknowledging that, others came forward, and that's when the things changed, and eventually that's when the parties proposed an, of course, settlement agreement. But I do love his philosophy. He's a Canadian, right? And together we can achieve the greatness that our country deserves. And our challenge and opportunity will be to work together. And I absolutely believe that this is a great country. You know, I wore the Canadian flag on my shoulder. I was very proud of my service to this country, very proud of other Indigenous veterans to this country. And but we do need to work together to achieve that greatness, you know. And one of the things that I did say, and I hope that you take on this challenge, that there's now an opportunity for all Canadians to engage in this work and make their own contributions to reconciliation. I now heard Senator Sinclair, sorry, I keep referring to him as Justice because that's what I called him for so many years, to make their own. And what he's saying now, he goes, I don't care what you do, read the 94 calls to action and unpack one of them. And that was I think the balance that we tried to find in the calls to action is to make sure that all Canadians can see themselves in one of them. So if you're an educator, if you're in the health profession as you are, politician, government of Canada, federal government, municipal government, that you can see yourself in one of them. So he's just challenging people to unpack one of them. And so what I would like to say to you folks here, in the near future, sit down with your colleagues and discuss in an honest, open, safe manner to discuss how we can contribute towards reconciliation. That's a very broad statement, but, you know, if there is a space, you know, for things to be done differently. One of the things that I do tell people is, you know, nothing will stifle reconciliation than the words, we've never done that before. And I hate those words. Nothing will stifle what do they call it? Innovation than the words never done that before. And I just shake my head and just like, so do things differently today or tomorrow than you did today or yesterday. And so that is a challenge that I would like to share with you. And I do want to say, Masi Chodas, thank you in my language, the Satu language. You know, I took this picture from the TRC because we heard so many stories that, and I just think it resonates with this, what's going on in the States right now, really. You know, this is, I do want to honor that this was not only for the children that were taken, but you know what, we heard so many stories of what was the community like after the children were taken and gone. And we heard so many stories of just the quietness of the community, you know, just with the occasional wailing of the mother missing her child after the bus or the plane or the truck left with all the children. So I do want to say thank you very much. I am on Twitter. I would love to get some new followers. You will note most, if not all, of my tweets are on reconciliation. I've lost it a couple times, especially around Donald Trump. And but especially some of the things that they're doing. They are demonizing the other right now, and what they're doing is, you know, they're separating parents from their children, and that's just wrong. This is my personal Hotmail account. I would love to hear from you if you want to send me some information, but please follow me. And I do want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much, Tim. I've just put into the chat box any questions, anyone. So Tim, we'll be able to see the questions from here. My question went out to all panelists and attendees. So I'm not sure whether you can see the chat box, but I can help moderate any questions that are coming. While we're waiting for the participants to post any questions, I just want to really thank you for your passion and for taking the time to present in this medium. I had a chance to hear you at the annual meeting, and your passion comes through just as well on this forum. So yeah, for that. It's such an emotional time, and I really appreciate you coming to share all of your experiences with us, and creating that safe space for us to be able to be on this journey. So it's been really a powerful hour and a bit, and I just really want to thank you for that. As we wait for questions, I also want to wish you great healing when you go back to the land and have some time with your family and connect with Mother Earth.
Yes.
And we just really, really send all our best wishes for you as you are on that journey as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Are there any questions? So far, we have none coming in, but we'll still pause for another couple of minutes. One question I have, or at least a comment, when the TRC was going on, one of the things that I learned was that they gathered all of the Kleenexes from the various, and they became part of a ceremony for the sacred tears. I wonder if you can comment on any of those processes.
Absolutely, and when in my process, I actually followed the same protocol. So one of the things, and we would try and follow the same protocol. So in Vancouver and Victoria, it was different. So at the end of the day, as you can imagine, there were a lot of tears that were shed, and there were paper bags that were left all over the place. And we had asked people to deposit them. And at lunchtime and at the end of the day, we went and gathered all of them. And in a very quiet kind of way, what we would do is we would gather all the tears that were shed.
Mm-hmm.
We had a sacred fire that would start up a day before, and on the very last day, we'd allow it to burn down in a very quiet way. At the end of the day, in ceremony, in accordance with the local protocol, at the end of each day, we would go and burn the tears that were shared. And at the end of, for the national events, there were 4 days. And so we would allow the sacred fire to burn down. And then a couple hours afterwards, we would go and we would gather the ashes. And so we kept them in an urn, and they would travel in with the bentwood box, which is one of our sacred items. And so those ashes now sit at the Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So in essence, what we have done was we had captured all the tears that have been shed for all of the events, and they are now housed in an urn at the Center for Truth and Reconciliation in the most sacred of place. So that's what we do. In my travels, in my presentations, I do the same thing, and I do ask that there be tissues, and I ask that they be collected, and I hold on to them, and then what I've done at a sacred fire here, I would follow with an elder here, and we would burn them. But what I'm going to do is I still keep in touch with Rai Moran, the Executive Director of the Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and I'm going to repatriate some of the, I'm going to make a trip to Winnipeg and have them burnt there. So that they can be added to the ashes can be added to the other tears that have been shed.
Wow, that's so great. I didn't know about the ashes, and that they were saved as well. So that's very.
The only place that it was slightly different was in British Columbia, and of course, it's beside an ocean. So a lot of their ceremonies are water-based. And so what they said, actually, we have sacred fires, but we don't deposit any. So we went down to the ocean and deposited the tears into the ocean. Okay. And so for me, as one of my jobs was, I would help out wherever possible. We didn't have a lot of staff, so we had to go down to the water and deposit the tears into the water, and so that was one of my honors to do that. And it was rather cold, but I was happy to put it out there for the survivors, and we followed that protocol. But that was the only time we did things differently.
That is great. Well, I'm really happy to know the result of that process. That's really interesting.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining us. I think that there are no questions. There are some comments about an amazing presentation, a little bit challenging to hear at times, but otherwise very good. And also we're letting people know that it'll be posted on our website. So I'm really happy that this will be available to as a journey, part of our journey as well, available to all of our members and those who choose to click on it and go through the presentation.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you very soon. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.